The U.S. government's decision to impose 25% tariffs on vehicles imported from Mexico and Canada sent shockwaves through the automotive industry. Originally intended as a way to punish economic rivals, the policy inadvertently set off a series of events that would fundamentally alter the landscape of the global auto industry. Among the hardest hit were the Japanese automakers, Toyota, Honda, and Nissan, who together account for nearly 1 in 3 vehicles on the road in the United States. While the policy was aimed at curbing imports from neighboring countries, it was the Japanese manufacturers who found themselves reeling. However, rather than retaliating in the traditional manner, Japan's response was swift, silent, and calculated. A strategic maneuver that would not only protect their economic interests, but set them up for long-term dominance in the global market. In response to the tariffs, Japan's automakers executed a pre-planned economic counter-strategy. This was not a knee-jerk reaction, nor was it marked by public outrage or fiery rhetoric. Instead, it was a silent yet decisive shift in production and strategy that would have profound implications for the future of the U.S. auto industry. Japanese automakers had long been preparing for such a moment, anticipating that the increasingly protectionist policies of the United States could eventually harm their business. As early as 2018, Japan had begun diversifying its supply chains, reducing its reliance on North American manufacturing, and positioning itself for a global transition in the automotive industry. The strategy was already in motion long before the tariffs were imposed. The first step in Japan's counter-strategy was to shift production from North America to Southeast Asia. Countries like Thailand, Vietnam, and Indonesia, which offered lower labor costs and favorable trade agreements, became the new hubs for manufacturing vehicles destined for global markets, including the United States. This move allowed Japanese automakers to circumvent the tariffs while maintaining competitive pricing for their vehicles. By rerouting production, Toyota, Honda, and Nissan were able to reduce their exposure to the U.S. market while still capitalizing on global demand. These Southeast Asian nations also offered an increasingly skilled workforce, making them ideal locations for high-tech automotive manufacturing, including the production of electric vehicles, EVs, and hybrid models. Another significant aspect of Japan's strategy involved accelerating the development of next-generation automotive technologies, such as electric vehicles and hybrid cars. The shift toward EVs had already begun globally, but Japan's automakers made a concerted effort to not only keep up, but to leap ahead of their competitors. With an eye on the future, Toyota, Honda, and Nissan began focusing heavily on developing solid-state batteries, an innovative technology that promises to revolutionize the EV market by providing longer range, faster charging times, and greater energy density. At the same time, Japan's automakers increased their efforts to develop compact EVs, which were expected to become more popular as consumers sought affordable, energy-efficient alternatives to traditional gas-powered vehicles. The shift to Southeast Asia and the push for new automotive technologies were not the only elements of Japan's broader response. Japanese automakers also took steps to reroute their supply chains, ensuring that production and distribution remained as smooth and efficient as possible, despite the changing trade environment. For instance, Honda made the decision to move the production of its Civic hybrid model from Mexico to Indiana. This move helped to reduce exposure to the tariffs while ensuring that Honda's popular hybrid vehicle would remain available to American consumers. It also demonstrated Japan's commitment to maintaining a strong foothold in the U.S. market despite the shifting landscape. But why did Japan choose not to retaliate publicly or aggressively against the tariffs? There were several reasons for this. First, Japan's response was based on long-term preparation, not immediate reaction. Since the rise of the America First rhetoric in 2018, Japan had been taking steps to diversify its manufacturing operations and reduce its dependence on U.S. production. This strategic foresight allowed Japan to avoid the kind of economic confrontation that would have ensnared both the U.S. and Japan in a destructive trade war. Instead of firing back with retaliatory tariffs or economic sanctions, Japan's approach was to subtly and quietly outmaneuver the United States. The second reason Japan did not retaliate in a public manner was a focus on economic resilience over confrontation. Engaging in a trade war with the United States would have been costly for both sides, but Japan recognized that the U.S. would be the ultimate loser if the tariffs were to remain in place. By shifting production away from North America and doubling down on innovation, Japan effectively reduced its vulnerability to U.S. trade policy, making its auto industry less dependent on the whims of American lawmakers. This strategy was about outlasting the U.S.'s protectionist policies, not engaging in a battle of words or threats. Japan's ability to adapt quickly to changing economic conditions allowed it to maintain its position as one of the world's leading automakers. As a result, the tariffs placed on Mexican and Canadian vehicles began to backfire. Rather than achieving the intended goal of reducing imports from rival nations, the policy instead disrupted the U.S. auto market in ways that were not anticipated. American dealerships began facing shortages of popular models, and consumers found themselves facing inflated prices for vehicles that were in limited supply. The lack of availability of certain models, particularly compact and hybrid vehicles, led to frustration among customers who were unable to find the cars they wanted. Meanwhile, the U.S. auto manufacturers, who had long abandoned the compact and hybrid segments in favor of larger vehicles, found themselves unable to capitalize on the growing demand for more fuel-efficient and environmentally friendly cars. This left Japanese automakers in a dominant position in a market that they had already invested heavily in. The fallout from the tariff policy didn't just affect the dealerships and consumers. Small suppliers in the United States, particularly those in states like Michigan and Texas, were hit hard by the disruption in supply chains. These suppliers, many of whom relied on business from Japanese automakers, suddenly found themselves with fewer orders and struggling to stay afloat. The shift in production away from North America further exacerbated these issues, leaving many small businesses facing financial uncertainty. The impact of these shifts in the supply chain would be felt for years to come as the U.S. auto industry struggled to regain its footing. Japan's broader economic response also included several key measures aimed at ensuring its continued global dominance. One of the most significant of these was a reduction in the purchase of U.S. bonds. While this might seem like a subtle financial move, it sent a clear message to the United States. Japan was no longer dependent on the U.S. economy to the extent it once had been. By reducing its exposure to U.S. debt, Japan subtly signaled its dissatisfaction with American trade policies without resorting to direct confrontation. At the same time, Japan worked to strengthen its alliances with other global economic powers, particularly the European Union and Southeast Asia. By diversifying its economic and diplomatic relationships, Japan ensured that it was less reliant on any one region, further reducing its vulnerability to U.S. policies. In the world of innovation, Japan's automakers were also not resting on their laurels. Toyota, Honda, and Nissan continued to invest heavily in cutting-edge technologies, including solid-state batteries for electric vehicles and compact EV designs that appealed to a wide range of consumers. These technological advancements were seen as crucial for Japan's ability to maintain its position in the global auto market. Toyota's pioneering work on solid-state batteries in particular placed it ahead of many of its competitors, including American automakers, who were struggling to develop their own next-generation battery technologies. Nissan likewise focused on compact EVs that were expected to become increasingly popular as consumers sought affordable, energy-efficient alternatives to traditional gas-powered vehicles. In conclusion, the U.S. tariffs on Mexican and Canadian vehicles set off a chain reaction that ultimately benefited Japan's automakers, who had been quietly preparing for such an event. Rather than retaliating with anger or threats, Japan's response was strategic and calculated, focused on long-term survival and dominance in the global market. By shifting production to Southeast Asia, accelerating the development of next-gen technologies, and rerouting supply chains, Japan effectively neutralized the impact of the tariffs while positioning itself for continued success. The real losers in this scenario were U.S. consumers, who faced higher prices, fewer options, and disruptions in the supply chain, as well as small businesses that relied on Japanese manufacturers. As the dust settled, it became clear that Japan had outmaneuvered the United States, proving that silent execution in the world of global trade often wins over loud policy decisions. The consequences of the U.S. tariffs on Mexican and Canadian vehicles were felt deeply across the American automotive landscape. In particular, American consumers found themselves at the mercy of rising prices and vehicle shortages that directly resulted from the trade policy. Dealerships, already struggling in a market fraught with supply chain issues and the lingering effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, found their inventories dwindling as popular models, particularly those from Japanese manufacturers, became increasingly scarce. For many American buyers, this meant paying higher prices for cars that were once more affordable. For others, it meant being forced into vehicle segments they were not necessarily interested in, but had no other option due to limited availability of their preferred models. The impact of these price hikes was felt most acutely among middle-class Americans, who traditionally had relied on compact and hybrid cars as their primary mode of transportation. Japanese automakers had long dominated the compact and hybrid vehicle segments, having invested heavily in fuel-efficient technology long before it became a priority in the United States. As the American auto industry leaned increasingly toward larger trucks, SUVs, and luxury vehicles, Japan's manufacturers took advantage of a growing global trend towards more fuel-efficient, environmentally friendly transportation. As a result, Japanese automakers were in a position to capitalize on rising consumer demand for compact, fuel-efficient vehicles, especially as gas prices began to climb once again. However, with the new tariffs disrupting their production and pushing their manufacturing operations out of North America, American consumers who had once been able to rely on affordable, reliable vehicles found themselves facing limited options. This shortage of vehicles didn't just affect consumers, it also put the squeeze on U.S. automakers. In the years leading up to the tariff imposition, American car manufacturers had largely abandoned the production of compact and hybrid vehicles in favor of large trucks and SUVs. The rationale behind this decision was simple. American consumers were buying larger vehicles, so it made sense to produce what was in demand. However, the Japanese manufacturers, with their forward-thinking strategies and investment in fuel-efficient technologies, continued to produce compact cars and hybrid vehicles, ensuring their dominance in this space. As a result, when the tariffs hit, U.S. automakers were caught flat-footed. They had neither the production capacity nor the market demand to fill the void left by the Japanese companies that were shifting their production away from North America. While the U.S. government may have believed it was punishing Japan with the tariffs, it was American consumers who ended up paying the price. Dealerships saw fewer models available for sale, and prices surged as a result. This was especially true for vehicles like the Toyota Corolla, Honda Civic, and Nissan Sentra, all of which were among the best-selling compact cars in the country. With fewer of these cars available, their prices soared, leaving many buyers with fewer affordable options. The situation was compounded by the fact that U.S. automakers had long since abandoned the compact car market, meaning they were ill-equipped to meet the new demand for smaller, more fuel-efficient vehicles. The problems in the American automotive market went beyond the consumer level. The tariffs had a significant impact on the supply chains that kept the industry running. Small suppliers, especially those located in Michigan, Ohio, and Texas, states that had long been home to the U.S. auto industry, were hit hard by the disruption in production. Many of these suppliers depended on business from Japanese automakers for parts and components, and the shift in production to Southeast Asia meant that these suppliers saw a significant decline in orders. As a result, many small businesses found themselves in a precarious financial position, struggling to stay afloat amid the economic turmoil caused by the tariffs. These small suppliers had long been the backbone of the U.S. auto industry, providing vital components to manufacturers like Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler. However, as the U.S. automotive market shifted towards larger vehicles, these suppliers had increasingly relied on business from Japanese automakers, who had not abandoned the smaller vehicle segments. The shift of production to Southeast Asia and the reduced need for components from U.S. suppliers created a ripple effect throughout the supply chain, with many of these smaller businesses facing layoffs, bankruptcies, or shutdowns. The U.S. automotive industry, once the world's leader in car manufacturing, found itself unable to compete with a Japan that had already strategically diversified its operations and invested in the next generation of automotive technology. Meanwhile, Japan's automakers had begun to look toward the future, ensuring that their operations were poised to thrive even as the U.S. market became more volatile. The key to Japan's strategy was not just diversification of manufacturing, but also diversification of market focus. By expanding their presence in Southeast Asia, Japan ensured that it could continue to meet the growing demand for vehicles in these rapidly developing markets. Southeast Asia, with its expanding middle class and increasing demand for affordable, fuel-efficient vehicles, became an important battleground for Japanese automakers, and they were quick to take advantage of this growing demand. By focusing on global markets beyond the U.S., Japan ensured that it was not overly reliant on the American market, which had grown increasingly unpredictable due to the rise of protectionist policies. In addition to shifting production and focusing on emerging markets, Japan's automakers were also investing heavily in the future of transportation. Electric vehicles and hybrid technology were a significant part of this investment. Toyota, for example, had long been a leader in hybrid vehicle development, with the Prius becoming one of the most recognized names in the industry. With the increasing focus on sustainability and environmental consciousness, Japan's automakers were ideally positioned to take advantage of the shift toward green technology. But they were not content to rest on their laurels. Toyota, Honda, and Nissan all began ramping up their investments in electric vehicle, EV development, particularly in the area of solid-state batteries. Solid-state batteries represent a major leap forward in EV technology, offering the potential for longer range, faster charging times, and greater energy efficiency compared to traditional lithium-ion batteries. Japanese automakers, recognizing the importance of this technology in the coming decades, made significant strides in developing and implementing solid-state battery technology. Toyota, in particular, was at the forefront of this innovation, with plans to introduce solid-state battery-powered vehicles by the early 2030s. By securing a lead in the race for next-generation battery technology, Japan's automakers were positioning themselves to dominate the global EV market, further solidifying their long-term competitiveness. In contrast, U.S. automakers, who had been slow to embrace hybrid and electric technologies, found themselves lagging behind. The U.S. auto industry had invested heavily in large trucks and SUVs, which remained popular among American consumers, but the focus on these vehicles had come at the expense of innovation in the hybrid and electric vehicle sectors. As a result, when global demand for green technologies surged, U.S. automakers were ill-prepared to capitalize on the trend. This left the door wide open for Japan's automakers to take the lead in the rapidly growing EV market. The tariffs, it seemed, had done more harm than good for the U.S. auto industry. Rather than punishing Japan, they had inadvertently allowed Japan's automakers to strengthen their position in the global market. By shifting production, diversifying supply chains, and investing in cutting-edge technology, Japan was able to weather the storm and emerge stronger than ever. Meanwhile, the U.S. auto industry found itself in a precarious position, with limited options for consumers and a weakened supply chain. The impact of these changes would be felt for years to come, as the U.S. automotive market struggled to regain its footing in the face of fierce global competition. As Japan's strategy continued to unfold, it became clear that the real loser in this trade war was the United States. The tariffs, which were meant to protect American jobs and industries, had backfired, leading to higher prices, fewer choices, and a weakened supply chain. The U.S. had miscalculated the consequences of its actions, failing to realize that Japan's response would not be one of open confrontation, but one of silent execution, an approach that would leave the U.S. to deal with the fallout of its own policies. The broader implications of the U.S. tariffs on Mexican and Canadian vehicles go beyond just the immediate disruptions in the American auto market. The policy inadvertently set in motion a series of events that have reshaped the competitive landscape of the global automotive industry. While the tariffs were initially presented as a means of boosting American manufacturing and protecting U.S. jobs, they ultimately led to unintended consequences that have placed the United States at a disadvantage in an increasingly globalized and interconnected economy. The rise of Japan's strategic response to these tariffs serves as a stark reminder of the importance of long-term thinking in global trade and the power of silent execution over loud policy. In the wake of the tariffs, Japan's response was not just a tactical move, it was a carefully orchestrated play in an ongoing economic chess game. Rather than engage in the kind of public retaliation that might have been expected in a typical trade war, Japan quietly recalibrated its operations and strengthened its position within the global auto market. This approach not only helped Japan avoid the direct economic confrontation that could have resulted from retaliatory measures, but also ensured that Japan's automakers continued to lead in the development of cutting-edge technologies and the exploration of new, high-growth markets. By diversifying production to Southeast Asia, accelerating innovation in electric and hybrid technologies, and restructuring supply chains to reduce dependence on North American manufacturing, Japan demonstrated the power of strategic foresight and resilience. This shift toward Southeast Asia, which had long been viewed as an emerging hub for automotive production, became a key part of Japan's counter-strategy. Southeast Asia's rapidly expanding economies and burgeoning middle class made it an increasingly attractive market for vehicles, and Japanese automakers were quick to recognize this opportunity. As a result, the U.S. tariffs, designed to target specific economic rivals, ended up backfiring in ways that few had anticipated. By shifting production to Southeast Asia, Japan not only insulated itself from the impact of U.S. trade policies, but also gained a significant foothold in one of the world's most promising automotive markets. This move helped to solidify Japan's long-term competitiveness, ensuring that the country would remain a dominant player in the global automotive industry. Meanwhile, the U.S. found itself grappling with the consequences of its own trade policies. Rather than emerging as the beneficiary of tariffs on its neighbors, the U.S. faced growing discontent among its consumers and a weakening of its automotive supply chain. Dealerships across the country were faced with shortages of popular Japanese models, and prices for these vehicles soared. As a result, many American buyers found themselves either paying more for cars or unable to access the vehicles they wanted at all. U.S. automakers, having long abandoned the compact car and hybrid vehicle segments, were unable to step in and fill the gap left by Japan's reduced production in North America. This left American consumers with fewer options, and in many cases, much higher costs. The situation was compounded by the disruptions in the supply chain. Small suppliers in Michigan, Ohio, and Texas, states that had long been hubs for the U.S. auto industry, were hit hard by the reduction in production by Japanese automakers. These suppliers, many of whom had long relied on contracts with Japanese car makers, found themselves scrambling to adjust to the new reality. With fewer parts and components being sourced from the U.S., these businesses were left with fewer orders and, in some cases, were forced to close their doors. The ripple effect throughout the supply chain caused significant economic harm, particularly in regions of the U.S. that had been most reliant on the auto industry. In contrast, Japan's broader economic response to the tariffs was carefully designed to avoid a direct confrontation with the United States. Rather than engage in a tit-for-tat trade war that could have further disrupted global markets, Japan focused on strengthening its economic ties with other regions, particularly the European Union and Southeast Asia. By diversifying its diplomatic and trade relationships, Japan was able to reduce its reliance on the United States and cushion itself from the impact of U.S. trade policies. This strategy allowed Japan to continue growing its automotive industry and positioning itself for future success, while the U.S., in its attempt to impose tariffs on its neighbors, inadvertently weakened its own position in the global economy. Japan's investment in electric vehicle technology also played a crucial role in its ability to adapt to changing market conditions. As the world shifted toward a more sustainable future, Japan's automakers were already at the forefront of EV and hybrid vehicle development. Toyota, Honda, and Nissan were actively investing in solid-state battery technology, which promises to revolutionize the EV market by offering longer range, faster charging times, and improved energy efficiency compared to traditional lithium-ion batteries. With this technology, Japan's automakers were poised to maintain a competitive edge in the rapidly growing global electric vehicle market. By prioritizing innovation and technological development, Japan's automakers ensured that they would remain at the cutting edge of the industry. While the U.S. government focused on tariffs and protectionist policies, Japan's automakers focused on the future, investing in technologies that would drive the next wave of automotive growth. This long-term approach allowed Japan to continue expanding its market share while the U.S. automotive industry struggled to adjust to the shifting tides of the global market. As a result of Japan's strategic response, the ultimate loser in this trade dispute was the United States. The U.S. government's tariffs, which were meant to protect American jobs and industries, instead resulted in higher prices, fewer choices for consumers, and a weakened supply chain. American automakers, who had long neglected the compact and hybrid vehicle segments, were unable to capitalize on the growing demand for more fuel-efficient and environmentally friendly vehicles. Meanwhile, Japanese automakers, who had strategically diversified their operations and focused on the future, emerged as the true winners of the trade conflict. The U.S. may have expected Japan to retaliate in the traditional manner, through direct confrontation and public outrage. However, Japan's response was far more calculated and effective. By quietly shifting production, investing in innovation, and diversifying its economic relationships, Japan outmaneuvered the U.S., ensuring its continued dominance in the global automotive industry. The U.S., on the other hand, found itself grappling with the consequences of its own policies, which had inadvertently weakened its own position and made it more vulnerable to competition from global economic powers like Japan. Looking ahead, the U.S. may be forced to contend with the long-term effects of its trade policies. As Japan continues to invest in the next generation of automotive technologies, including electric vehicles and solid-state batteries, the U.S. auto industry may struggle to keep pace. The tariffs, which were intended to protect American workers and industries, may ultimately prove to be a self-inflicted wound, one that will take years to heal as the U.S. faces the consequences of a weakening automotive sector and rising consumer discontent. In the end, the true lesson from this economic standoff is that in global trade, it is not always the loudest or most aggressive policies that win. Japan's ability to remain silent and adapt quickly to changing circumstances allowed it to outmaneuver the U.S. and solidify its position as a global leader in the automotive industry. The U.S., on the other hand, may find itself struggling to recover from the consequences of its own actions, forced to contend with the fallout of a self-inflicted economic wound that has left its auto industry in a vulnerable position. By 2030, it's possible that Japan will emerge even stronger, while the U.S., still reeling from the effects of its own tariffs, will struggle to maintain its place at the table. The lesson is clear. In the world of global trade, silent execution often trumps loud policy, and those who are best prepared for the future will always have